Well, thank you very much, Jason. This is Mike Simmons, and I'm here with Dr. Ron Carriveau. And we are coming to you live from beautiful downtown Denton. You ever heard the joke, Ron? These are faces made for radio. But this is pretty much a live shot from just a few minutes ago to give you a sense of where we are and what we're doing. Ron and I didn't want to take the poll because we weren't sure whether we were novice or intermediate, but I think hopefully by the end of the day we'll all be in the advanced category. So thanks again for taking the time. We're going to assume that some of you were here last week and that some of you weren't. So if you were here last week for the opening session about measuring using outcomes, then some of this will be a repeat. We'll try not to do too much of that, but yet enough to make sure that those who are here for the first time have at least a basic understanding of what we're talking about. And as you can see from the screen, today we're talking about the implications of measurement. The first implication related to reporting and improvement. Next week we'll get into measuring and improving instruction in more specific ways. So that said, let's jump into things. Ron, have I forgotten anything in the introduction?
Just that the guy on the left was Mike, the big guy.
Oh, yeah.
I was the other guy.
Okay, I gotcha. All right. So for today, here's our agenda. We will first review the things we talked about last week in our three-level model and the basic reporting. Next, we will talk about monitoring learning and formative assessment. And we'll talk in more detail about using outcome attainment for evaluation. Refresh our memory and talk a little bit more detail about what we think accreditation agencies and organizations are wanting. And then we'll talk about something that's very important in terms of evidence, the validity issues, item validation, identifying and fixing flawed items, some very specific, we think, helpful tips for that, because in the end, the notions of validity and reliability are important to everything we're talking about. So we hope to demonstrate that as we go along. So that said, I'm going to go through a quick review of what we talked about last week. And so if you recall, our outcome-based assessment model is not anything that should be foreign to any of you. It's simply the idea that you are writing good outcome statements that are clear and measurable, and that you are using them with accurate assessments, obtaining the attainment value measures, and then using that to evaluate the courses and programs and to evaluate and improve student learning. So that's basically the outline of our 3 weeks presentations. And right now, today, we're focusing mostly on evaluating and improving courses and programs. And most of the theoretical and practical work from this comes from Dr. Carrivau's book called Connecting the Dots. This is not a shameless plug. It's simply a recognition of his work in this area, and we're grateful to have his expertise here.
I'll go ahead and get this one.
Okay.
Last week we also reviewed the structure of the outcomes model, and everything you see on the screen is a learning outcome. To differentiate the different levels, I use the goal level for the broader level that really is not measurable in itself. And so to be able to break that down, we go to another level, the 1.1 level, which is just the general learning outcome level. And from there, you have to get more specific, because to write outcomes, we need something that is very measurable. And those are the statements that fall in the specific learning outcome. It differentiates it from the group, which is the SLO. And of course, the key is we have to be able to connect those statements with a test item. And the test item can be selected response, constructed response, performance, product. In this case, it's demonstrated as a multiple choice item. And we mentioned that all of the tagging that we need to do to get a report can be done with this page from the screen from ExamSoft. And we can tag many different ways, and we'll be talking about that later on in a little more depth. And this is how you calculate one of those values. And we mentioned that last week. We covered this in more detail, but the first 4 items have percentage correct values that can be averaged up to the 1.1.1 outcome, and it would be 81, which would be 81% of that outcome was attained by the group that took those items. And it's the same logic all the way through. All the action for instructors is on the first specific outcome. They want to know what happened with my outcome attainment, because that's where the decisions are made for instruction. The next 2 levels instructors like to know, but they're more for reporting. And you could report at program level or an institutional level with the goal that's eventually derived from these values. And Mike is going to talk about these reports briefly.
So these are, we say hand generated, not really, but the idea here is however you generate these graphically or physically, the notion of the attainment versus the criterion. And we are all familiar with that. And as an instructor, you have in your mind your own expectation of learning by students, that criterion. In some instances, you are told what that criterion is through an external body, a program, an institution, etc. So there are different ways to get the criterion, and in this case, it's a mathematical exercise basically between the attainment of a specific outcome and the criteria you set and the difference. So it's really pretty clear, and the judgment part comes in setting the criterion. And then the same thing as we move up or out the scale at that GLO level, and finally at the broader level. So in the case of the 1.1.1, that's generally, as Ron said, at the instructor level, looking at specific learning outcomes there. And then when we get up into the 1.1 level, you're talking more about potentially department goals or program goals or major goals, and then upward into more institutional or college level goals, just depending on the depth of the structure that you basically have to report up. As you can see, it just works, the system works its way up, as we saw in the previous slide. So we talked about this last week a good amount, but we wanted to just refresh your mind. And then where we went last week was also to show some of the ExamSoft indicators of this in a more visually appealing way. So this is a summary report that an instructor would get on a specific assessment, and you can see sort of the student performance issues and opportunities, and then the learning outcomes, the attainment values in essence, but presented in a way that's graphically helpful, low, average, and high. It's another presentation of the criteria versus attainment data that we've seen. So that said, Ron, you want to talk a little bit about rubrics?
Yeah, we just wanted to make clear from last week also that you can calculate outcome attainment values from rubric scores. And in this case, the outcomes are on the left, the 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And there are a couple ways to calculate the scores. You can get averages and divide them into the number of anchor points, and that's called compensatory scoring, because a high score will compensate for a low score on one of the cells. And then conjunctive is if you feel that all the students need to achieve a certain proficiency point, then it might be, we might want to accept only 3s or 4s from the rubric, and that would be then the percentage of students that got those scores.
So in this case, these 4 students received at least 3 or 4, therefore 80% attainment of those 5 students, right?
Yep.
That's the conjunctive. Okay.
And we also showed a summary report for the chemistry exam that we were using chemistry items last week. And you can again see the structure here with the learning outcomes. So the instructor gets a nice picture of the 3 levels, 1, 1.2 in this case, and 1.2.1, etc.
Regardless of the type of assessment, rubric-based or multiple choice. Yeah. Okay. So that's sort of a good review. Okay. So now we're going to move into the second part about monitoring learning and formative assessment. And Ron, go ahead and talk about these.
Yeah, we typically have 2 basic types of assessment: the summative, where you have to have data to make a judgment on, and the formative. So let's talk about the summative first, because we want to focus on the formative for the next part. And that's, I like to express that as it's the degree to which students have learned. I mean, they're through, it's time to give a grade. And the students in the summative are judged in that summary way. It's a final judgment. And the use of the test score is what really makes it a summative. Folks say, well, I have a summative test, but what they're really meaning is the score is my summative score. And in the formative, it's the degree to which students are learning. So we see here the formative aspect. And in this case, the students are allowed to use the results to improve. It's not a final judgment. And mastery levels can be set with formatives, because that would ensure that they can do well on the summative. And again, it's the use of the test score that makes it formative. So if students get to do this retaking the test, it puts it in the formative category. If you gave a summative test and you let them retake it, it would then become a formative. And we're really interested in feedback as one of the formative components. And Mike can talk now about the results from some studies.
Well, sure. And so there's feedback work going on all around the country in various formats. And so we're probably all familiar with the Stanford study that talked about giving feedback to students on various data points. And the same thing with the Purdue Signals program and then the Turo Osteo study. And there are a number of these going on. And I think the point we want to make is that pretty much all of the literature talks about early and often, right? So if you're an instructor, and many of you are, and many of you probably were an instructor, you realize the importance of getting this kind of formative assessment, formative feedback to students as early and often as you can for the purpose of improvement. So that's basically the idea behind measuring with attainment values, so you can get that very specific information. And one of the important tools that we've found in ExamSoft, making it easier, is the idea of longitudinal analysis. In other words, how is that improvement going? And this is sort of the background, the insiders look at how those filters are set, and you can look and see, for example, filter by category. How are my students doing on? Whether it's the specific assessment or a very targeted learning outcome, in order to generate this kind of report. And both Ron and I have worked extensively with Dr. Rob Petrus here at UNT. He's a chemistry professor teaching organic chemistry, and he's done some really pioneering work in terms of this whole relationship we're talking about, of writing meaningful outcomes that are specific, assessing students both in formative and summative ways, and changing his instruction almost in real time. In other words, a Tuesday formative quizzing results in changes Thursday or Friday for him, based on these kinds of signaling that occur in the ExamSoft reports he uses. So, for example, in this case, he could see that only 3 of 8 students clearly understood this concept and construct. And so what he would do in that case is adjust his materials, his instructions, his assignments, etc., pretty much on a weekly basis. And that's really what we're talking about in formative assessment. But you've got to have good data to do good formative assessment, right? And that's what we're arguing for, this very specific data that are tagged to items, which are tagged to granular learning outcomes. Another view of this kind of reporting, student's view. So Dr. Petrus or anyone would send this out, and a student would see on the various learning outcomes where they stand. In this case, this student in pretty good shape on the green. So this kind of signaling is important to students. You could theoretically, I guess, send this back as a chart or table or something, but I think we all realize that the value of dashboarding in the current environment is very important. So in this case, you see a student has some areas of improvement and some spots they really need to look at, and it becomes a valuable feedback tool, and that's our point about formative assessment. And then we get into summative and formative exam data that Dr. Petrus has used, and this is just one sample, but he is looking again at these scores, and then he's looking at what happened after he changes, and you can see sort of where the jump is. So the average scores 56, and then they moved up in the scoring, and then the learning outcome attainment. And this is post remediation. In other words, after he made the changes based on this formative feedback he got from students. And really, you know, the grade's interesting, but to us, it's this 0.75 and this 0.92, and these attainment of learning outcomes. That's pretty interesting. He's moved folks up, and you and I talk about this, Ron.
Yeah, these are the reliabilities here, the 75 and 92. But what the jump in here is from your 56 score, and notice that the lowest scoring students, 27% of them, and 97% of the high scoring students, and those figures jumped up from 56 to 71 when it came to the final. So whatever he was doing, and we know he's done a lot of different types of instructional strategies and given a lot of learning strategies to the students, he had these great jumps, and this was based also on a national chemistry test. So it wasn't like he was gearing his numbers here just to his outcomes in his course, but he also was able to get these same types of high values when he used the national chemistry test.
I think we'll talk about this more next week, but the idea that he's moved lower performing students up is pretty significant, and that results basically from his instructional changes and feedback to students. And we'll get into that a little bit more next time, but you get a sense of what we're talking about here. And then similarly, an essay test. We just wanted to show that you could do sort of the same thing and show sort of the same improvements.
And when the student sees the students can see this report too. This is the strengths and improvement part for the essay, and they can see where they're weaker and where they're stronger. The scale up there goes from 1 to 4. This happens to be a 4, fair, good, excellent, but we try to stay away from the word 4 because you can put whatever titles you want on it. But clearly the student is excellent on outcome 1.2.1 and needs a lot of work on 1.2.4.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to mention is you may be saying, well, I can do something like this in another program. Yeah, there are some rubric feedback programs in which you can give this kind of feedback and things. The challenge becomes the mapping of the items here. Certainly a number of rubric programs, Blackboard, GradeMark, etc., will give feedback to students and indicate sort of where they stand. The question is, how specifically are they tagged to items, and then what kind of data can you get out? So for example, you know, you're going to get that very specific feedback
and
to
the student would
students.
see that right there.
Yes, and so again, you know, we want to acknowledge ExamSoft in this regard, but also recognizing, I mean, heck, you could do this writing a note to students, but we're talking about scope and scale here. So in a small class, yeah, could you give feedback that says you need to improve on this learning outcome? based on your, absolutely, you could do that by hand, you could pull them aside, you could have office hours, and many of us do that. But at a certain point, when you get into, you move from tens to hundreds to, in some cases, thousands of students, how do you get meaningful feedback? And I think that's what we've been chasing, because at UNT, for example, we have 8,000 sections a semester, and over 300 of those sections are larger than 125 people. That's not to brag, that's simply to say that we've got a lot of instructors who are facing volume problems, and to give meaningful feedback to students, and very specifically, you need tools and things. I think that's sort of where we're coming from on this. Okay, so we're going to jump forward, and Ron's going to talk a little bit about using outcome attainment for evaluation.
And this is just a little review of what Mike covered before, so we'll fly right through it. It's just a reminder that we can get this information. And we talked last week about grades and reporting attainment without the grades. At the course level, we can say things like the class as a whole met the criteria on 4 out of 5 specific learning outcomes, as evidenced from the table we just looked at. The class met the criterion on both general outcomes and the overall goal. We covered these last time. An important goal is to raise the general outcome to 82, and there could be improvement for increasing differences in the scores. So today we're taking it up one more level. We're looking at using those course goal values, which are on the top rows of each of the tables, and mapping them to program goals, which are shown underneath. So there are 5 program goals that are being addressed at our institution, and they're addressed, the goals from the course are related to them, and to get a value, we would move that value. For example, I'll go ahead and click on that. So from goal 2 that addressed program goal 2 to a column in our tabulation for the program goals. And for the second course, they had a goal 3 that contributes to the same thing that course 1 was measuring, which is program goal 2. And the same logic for course 3. And in fact, course 3 had 2 goals that they could address in their course. They all were they're all addressing the program goal 2, and if you take the average of those, you get, that's where that 0.81 comes from, the calculation table that we showed. And this is all good, it's good stuff, but it is, again, labor intensive, and even if you can get it out of your LMS, it's not always that easy to extract. So if we want to say things like students in the program met the criterion on 4 out of 5 program goals, or the program met its criterion on 2 of the goals, or then make an improvement statement, we'd like to get that information in a faster form and in a more complete form. And if we want to, did we just do institution? No, okay, we're going to use the same values here to map up to the, that was institution.
No, that was course to program,
sorry, okay.
And this is program to institution.
So we're going up the next level. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm anxious to see that ExamSoft table. Okay, so go ahead and click it. And we're using the same numbers here just for convenience, but you can see it's the same idea. Those program goal values that were calculated in the last tables can then be moved into the institutional level. And in this case, all of those values coming out of the program are worded syntactically, semantically. They're saying the same thing as that institutional goal 2. And again, as we talked about last time, was you do have to have communication between the course, the program, and the institution, so that you are looking, either mapping down from what the institution said or mapping up from what the course produced.
This is relatively easier in things like core or general education courses, where they're kind of commonly mandated up and down the chain. In other words, the institution has certain standards, the curriculum committee has certain standards, so the course has certain standards. There are other courses that are outside those where you have to do a better job of directly communicating language up and down the chain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so these are statements that could be made at the institutional level then, that goal 1 was met. SACS likes to know that. And they'll say, well, how do you know? And then they say, because we have all these values that we can map all the way back even to an item. And perhaps the criterion for goal 2 was 2 points less than, than the criterion. And we want to raise it. We want to move the goal 2 up. So you can look at improvement, you can look at comparison, you can look at differences.
So we want to just go back and refresh ourselves so that we have a context for this, and this will be a quick one. But what we believe, and again I'll caveat that and say, both Dr. Carriveau and I have a number of years' experience working with SACS, and we realize that's not the only accrediting body, but based on that experience and what we know and read and hear and see and attend these meetings, we think that there's an ongoing scrutiny of this issue. And as you can see from this diagram, look at all the connections between who needs to know what and who wants to know what at this point. Of course, the students in the course is the most important, and that's our premise. It's the generator of the information. Mainly, we want to improve learning for students and student success. We also want faculty to understand it, but then there are the other things: program, institution, accrediting bodies, et cetera, and they're all in the conversation now. So, and everyone who's on this presentation right now understands what I'm talking about. This is a spider web of communication. So, we're just going to pull up examples we talked about last week in terms of SACS 3.3.1 and the kind of language they use. Middle states. You probably have your own example. There are probably examples from disciplinary accrediting bodies, AACSB, NCATE, etc. Similar things, that kind of language we're starting to see, both in policy and practice. So, where we're working from is that we don't want, they don't want, and we don't want the measuring stick to be grades or percentage of grades or success rate. Those are very important pieces of data, but we think it's more useful to have SLOs. So in other words, the grades don't directly address the student learning outcomes or specifically tell you where improvement is needed in terms of learning outcomes. Again, grades are useful and you're not going to get away from them, but using a learning outcome structure, we believe, is the wave of the present because of the wave of the future. I think it's just right upon us. So we've taken this approach. So, and I'm just going to talk briefly about what I think is, we've thrown this word out to be a little bit provocative, census approach. In other words, right now most of us sample and we'll take an example of a program, or we'll pull a course out and say, here's the success rate, or those kinds of things. And I think we're all evolving past that, and what we're suggesting is, with tools like ExamSoft and an increasingly sophisticated faculty, we have the opportunity to consider a census approach. In other words, data from everyone, which goes down a road that we won't talk about here, but it's almost to individual competency assessment. And I say to folks, if we're at a point where we can, shouldn't we? And that's an open question we won't debate here, but I've reached a point where I think the technology is almost upon us. So in this case, we just showed the numbers, and now we're showing a graphic representation of how these course level goals and report up to the program level goals. And this is a graphic representation of the chart we just saw with the numbers in it. Hopefully gives you a different perspective. You can see two courses reporting to program goal 1, and 3 to program goal 2, and 3 to program goal 3. And then, of course, to the institutional strategic goal. And so that's a graphic representation of it. So in this case, we've basically put in the numbers, and it's the same thing. You can see how the values are calculated, contributing to the program goal and contributing to the institutional strategic goal.
And next week we'll be talking too about how to go beyond that level.
Absolutely.
Outside sources.
Yeah. So Ron, I know you wanted to look at this thing because it's very valuable.
Yeah, this is a nice encapsulation of what we've been talking about obtaining information from different courses, be they in the same discipline or different disciplines. And we're going to talk about QDP a little bit next week, and the tuning and AC&U rubrics, and how that demand is being put on. And in this case, you can see the courses, and on the left-hand side, the learning out objectives. This was an example of from a nursing degree program, and the outcomes are they were interested in Bloom's taxonomy. But those on the left, those outcomes could be, Goal 1, GLO 1.1, or specific learning outcome 1.1.1. Really nice summary chart to make decisions on.
So in the somewhat limited amount of time we have left, we have two very important topics that we want to get to. They are somewhat more technical and a little bit more complex, but Ron is going to walk us through these important points related to validity.
And I'm going to be going a little bit faster. Excuse me, John. I'm going to get a sip here. And because we are running short on time. Excuse me. And we mentioned last time the basic process of asking the student a question, getting a score, and the key thing is how are we going to use that score and interpret it, because that's the essence of validity. And the properties we look at always in test scores, as we alluded to before, are the consistency, which is a piece of validity evidence. So we're still looking for validity evidence. Reliability is a piece of that. And the degree to which a score can be used and interpreted as was intended is what validity is about. But we need evidence. So we get evidence of validity for able to use our score the way we want, when we intended, by making sure the items match the SLOs, and making sure the instruction matches the SLOs, making sure test items match the instruction. We covered that last week, but now we're saying, what if all that happens? What else might be a validity issue? And it would be your test item. And there are two types generally: the selected response, where students, of course, select, and it's an objective measure because you don't have raters. Nobody's arguing about did they get it right or wrong. In constructed response, the student constructs a written response, does a performance, or produces a project, and always has a degree of subjectivity to it, because there are a rater either if they rescored, might score differently, typically do, or different raters score differently. So you're still interpreting that score, and that's why it's classified in all the literature as subjective. And to talk about item analysis, you have to really be familiar with the parts of an item. We're going to talk about a multiple choice item here quickly. Folks say, I have 20 questions on my test, and I know what that means. It means they're usually meaning I have 20 items on my test, because everything you see there is the test item. The stem, or generally it's a question, and you have 3 choices or options, and I'll talk about why there are only 3 here in a minute. One is the absolutely correct answer. And then you have 2 options that are called foils or distractors. Why have those? Well, if someone answers A, we want to be sure that they really knew that, so we give them an opportunity to show that that's true by giving them a couple of good distractors. Remember, in assessment, we're trying to find out what the student knows, not what the student doesn't know. So we might have some flawed items, and why would we want to get rid of them? Well, the research shows that flawed, and we're talking about multiple choice here, flawed multiple choice items can be up to 15 percentage points more difficult than when item writing rules were followed. And that would make values like the median passing score lower. And in this case, the research showed it was 3.5 percentage points lower. So students who are taking these flawed items don't have a fair chance to show what they know. And they're not really being addressed by what was intended by the item. The students that they're disadvantaged the most by this, by the flawed items, are those that are at the cut points or near passing, because the students that are not doing as well have the most trouble with flawed items. Some of the higher end students kind of figure out what's going on. So what makes an item flawed? Simple. The item writer violated item writing guidelines about what to do and what not to do when writing multiple choice items. And you've probably seen these listed in many different sources. The other reason is that statistically that item is not functioning too well, and for some reason less than 50% of the students chose the correct answer. So it's an indicator, it's a flag. It says, yeah, there could be a flaw here, and so I better go back and see if I violated any item writing rules. And in my book there, the rules are listed, and Halladina, Downing, Rodriguez, all the well-known people in the field have written all these different guidelines down, and I've tried to put explanations for them in the book. So if it says don't give clues, an example is if you say physician in the question and you put physicians as an option, the students are going to right away say, well, physicians couldn't be that because we got a clue from physician. And one other, just as an example of the rules, because there are about 42 of them, is to avoid negatives such as not or except. Why? It's because the student has to keep reconstructing in their minds the answer choices. There's a short-term memory problem associated with that. They have to try to figure out what is not correct as well as what is correct. And a lot of times, as you know, they'll read right through the not. For answer choices, those were for writing questions and stems. For answer choices, there was a set of rules too. It says avoid words that none of the above and all of the above. That conflicts with having one correct answer, and it can be a clue if the student knows more than one, like 2 out of 4 choices. And then they have to use a different strategy for this type item. This item is, an item with these words is not recommended. And don't use non-positive words such as not, except, doesn't, didn't, and wouldn't. They're a little less problematic for an answer choice compared to a question or a stem, but they should be avoided. Sometimes you might have a case where you really need them. If you're ending up with having to write many, many extra items rather than using one of these, if it's well done, you could probably still come out with a decent item. The recommended strategy, though, is consider positive phrasing first. Now, this page shows on the left-hand side item writing rules for the stem or the question, on the right-hand side for the options. And this presentation is going to be made available to you. So I'm just saying these are the 2 big categories. If you go across the rows, you're talking about the stem on one side, a question on the other, and in the columns you're talking about good properties, and the other side, what to avoid. And my approach is I want to do all those good things that's going to make the item better, but if I avoid what not to do, then I'm going to be safe. It's the not avoiding what you should avoid that makes a flawed item. And it always, the question comes up, how about why are you only showing 3 items? If you had 4, wouldn't the guessing, it'd be harder for them to get points for guessing, because it'd be 0.25 versus 0.33. And that's might be true, except students just don't guess. And even guessing randomly and trying to get a certain number of items correct, trying to get 33%, for example, is very difficult. You can see there the values for guessing 2 items just by random, and up to 5 items. And it gets up to 70. If you want to try to get 70% correct on a well-developed test with multiple choice items, the random guessing alone, 0.0000356. So the argument about 3 and 4 options doesn't hold up. And in a recent meta-analysis, 80 years of published empirical studies, and I have several other studies besides these, but this was a well-known one and well-used. Rodriguez in 2005 determined that the appropriate number of options for multiple choice is 3. 1 correct, 2 plausibles. Using more doesn't improve the item scores statistically and typically results in implausible distractors, because look at this, 4 options, and the correct answer is A, options C and D, and all faculty I've talked to will tell you this, and I've written thousands of items, I have the same problem. I get 2 really good plausible options, C and D, and then I got to struggle for the 4th one. If some of you are shaking your heads, then you're agreeing. That's always harder. The students must know it, because look at me, only 2.02 chose it. And that was a good item. Now here's a really bad item, because 21% of the students got it correct, it was D, but 49 chose C. So I have to go back and look at this. But again, one of the options, the 4th option, A, is hardly chosen. And if you added 5 or 6 options, then you'd just be spreading these numbers out. You'd still have the ones that are the students recognize as, yeah, that's the one that an instructor had to stay up half the night for because it's hard to write. And you can add, with 3 options, you can add more items to your test, which increases what? Reliability. So if you want to really analyze your item, then you need to look at a couple other things. And this is typical values here. You have the proportion correct, and you have the number of students in the lowest scoring group that chose the item, and the number in the highest scoring group that chose the item. This is a well-discriminating item, because more of the high students scoring it, or the ones that should have gotten it correct, did, and the ones that should have missed it, did. And if you subtract 35 from 86, you get this discrimination index, which is 51. It will vary depending on how many students actually answer and who are in these groups. But it's a reasonable index to use to evaluate your item. Notice on the left side there are 3 negatives and 1 positive when we're using the point-by serial, which correlates this particular item with the total scores on the test for all the students. And I look for that pattern, and when I see that gives me an indication this item is functioning pretty well. But look what happened here. This was the key response, 21, and this is the one where you just talked about. 49% chose it, almost the same number as lows as high chose it, and I don't know what to do with this. I just know it's not a good item. I either violated the item writing rules, that's my first thought, or maybe I miskeyed it, or I didn't teach it like I thought I did, or I said something that was different from something in the book, or it rained that day and nobody got to class. There's always a reason, and that's why you need to go back and validate these items if you're going to make decisions about the outcome values that are derived from them. This is a good item. You can see some of the patterns, and so is that. You can see the discrimination index varies a little bit, like I said, because of the number of students that get it correct or incorrect. So that's the basic approach to item validation, and I mapped this out more in the book, but this either has to come from a separate program or getting it out of an LMS, which is not easy. So I'm very happy that I can get this information from the question analysis in ExamSoft, and additionally I get a reliability coefficient, standard deviation, the mean, median, lowest score, highest score, number of points, and I can look at my item. I'm using a trackball, as you might, I'm shaking a little bit here. So I have the item difficulty, that's my outcome attainment value. And you can see the responses from the upper and lower groups. There's that discrimination index we talked about, point by serial, and I get all that same information for option A, option B, and option C. So if I do have something that looks askew, I can use this to fix it. If you have a bad item because you violated the item writing rules and you go back and you fix it, these numbers are all going to change. So even that really bad item that I had, if I fix it, I know it's going to change for the better. Okay, at this point, we want to just, what's our time?
52.
Okay, I'm going to fly through this because we got to give you a chance to ask a couple of questions. These are types of constructed response items that you're probably familiar with. You're probably familiar with rubrics. And we talked about this already, that you can actually derive outcome attainment values from rubric scores. And you get those also in the rubric analysis in ExamSoft. So these are tables that are very valuable for folks who really want to make sure that they have a valid, that their items are producing valid scores, so the decisions they make then aren't in question. Okay, Jason, we got it, I think.
Well done, gentlemen. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We do have a few questions. First being, who were involved in defining learning outcomes and linking them up to the overall program goal? How do you get faculty and administration, accreditation people to work together in attaining this?
Well, that's Mike's job. He works really hard at it, so I'm going to kind of explain some of it.
Well, it is work, and I tried to explain earlier, sometimes there are situations where it naturally occurs in the case of core or general ed classes where there are institutional state or other standards that sort of lay on top of it. So if I've got a communications competency in the Texas core, there's no real discussion about that definition, and a number of courses have to do that. But when you get into other learning outcomes, other than just those general ones, you know, the right answer is that always starts with faculty, but faculty have to be informed of context. And by context, I mean, are there program or major goals? Are there disciplinary accreditation standards? Like we used chemistry. So you have the American Chemical Society, and they have standards, or the American Journalist Society, or AAC. You know, all these folks in your various disciplines have standards or outcomes, and the question is whether they're specific and measurable. But they give you sort of an opportunity to have the conversation without having to start from scratch. Most places, most classes, most topics have somewhere to start, and that's easier. And so to having somewhere to start is the key. If you're just starting from scratch, right, that becomes a really just a conversation. It comes down to skills.
And they come to our learning center for the training, and we have a whole program that they can participate in to ferret through all of their issues, and shows them how to use the model to link up all of their instruction with their outcomes with their test items.
You know, what's interesting is we find that it's not so much that faculty don't have learning outcomes, it's that they have tens of learning outcomes, many of which are not measured at all the levels, in such a way that you could not possibly teach that much, and students couldn't possibly learn that much, and you could not possibly measure them. So it's not really a conversation about creating, it's more about organizing and focusing. That's what we find. No faculty member walks in and says, well, I have no expected outcomes. That's never happened to me, you know, unless they're a brand new instructor, and then they usually get handed those kinds of things. So I think that's what we'd say about that, Jason.
Excellent, thank you. Another question. A majority of our test items have a difficulty index value of greater than 0.7. Is that a good standard? And perhaps you could discuss briefly one or two points on the minimal values for data with a small sample size.
The difficulty levels typically should be about 0.50, and anything less would be suspect. So I think the question is there a recommended level? And there isn't. You set the criterion or the pass level for the course, and if you have some items that are harder and easier, then that's going to balance out. But there's no specific rule other than the 0.50 that talks about the items. And I'm not sure that answered the question, so you want to ask it again just to make sure?
Certainly. The question was, a majority of our test items have a difficulty value of greater than 0.7. Is this okay? And
I got you. Yeah. In other words, what you're saying is my items appear to be less difficult for students because they're all doing well. They're all, the items are indicating that the value is 0.7 because that's how the student scored. If you wanted to make a harder test, then those would drop. I think after a semester in a course that the students have been told this is what you need to know and be able to do, and you put them in a learning environment where they can do it, and you teach what you say you're going to teach, and you assess what you say you're going to assess, and that's all aligned. I'd expect the scores to be, the item values to be up in the 0.70s to 0.90s, because that is determined by the student's response. It's not like magically an item has that value. You only know if the item's hard or easy after all the students take it. And that depends on did they learn it or not, or some extraneous reason. I hope that answers that question.
Excellent. Thank you. We did receive several questions on if you could please go back to the slide that contained the references to the Yale study and the Purdue study. That way the attendees could write down those references for further review.
And they'll be able to see this online again too, right?
Yes, and we will be sharing the slide deck with attendees, and so those references will be included in the presentation when we make that available in just a few days. So if you did miss that reference, we will share that.
Pull it up right here too.
So as they pull up this presentation, or pull up that slide rather, I will say that I would like to take the opportunity to remind everyone that at the conclusion of today's webinar, you will receive a 7-question survey. This survey helps us continue to provide relevant content in all of our presentations. And those who do complete the survey will be entered into a drawing for a $25 gift card to Amazon.com. I would like to remind everyone of our next presentation, which is part 3 in this series, which is entitled Using Outcome Attainment Values to Make Valid Instructional Design Decisions. This is also presented by Drs. Carriveau and Simmons of the University of North Texas. This presentation is scheduled for April 22nd, 2015 at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time. With that, these are the 3 studies referenced earlier in the presentation. I would like to go ahead and conclude today's presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today. Thank you, Dr. Carriveau and Dr. Simmons, for sharing your expertise with us in yet another informative session on the use of assessment data. This concludes our presentation today. We do